Do you catch yourself reacting in ways that push others away, but then you feel guilty and confused? Or were you ever called a narcissist and wondered, what does that really mean? If any of this sounds familiar, you're not alone. And that's exactly why I created Office Hours with Dr. Anthony Mazzella. That's me. Office Hours is a low-cost, small group space where you could bring your questions about these thoughts and experiences. Together, we'll work through confusion and help you build healthier relational patterns. Basically, this is a space designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If that sounds like you, just click the link in the show notes below to join us for our next meeting. Okay, I hope to see you there. Healing must involve learning to tolerate what's been hidden and tolerating the vulnerability that was once unbearable. What's the vulnerability here? It's the taking on the new clients. It's the dating. It's going to the gym, right? Because all of these things have to do with what? Being exposed. This is the stage where narcissistic defenses loosen just enough to allow authentic emotional experiences. So in other words, if one musters up the courage to take on the new clients, to go on a date, right? What's going to come up is a new experience. And that's really where the work gets interesting, is looking more closely at all of what comes up when one puts themselves in a more vulnerable position, because now they're in uncharted territory. Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In this episode, we continue exploring what it truly means to heal from narcissism, not just by letting go of the grandiose fantasies, but by facing what those fantasies were protecting. They could be feelings of inadequacy, shame, and the parts of ourselves we've long avoided. Today we're exploring a powerful example of that shift. What happens when, and I quote, success no longer brings relief or joy, but a creeping sense of dread? To bring this struggle to life, I want to share a composite, or what we might call a prototypical example. I want to emphasize, and I'm going to quote, success can include any goal you have in mind to improve yourself or to improve your life, whether that's eating healthier, going to the gym, investing in meaningful relationships, or even starting to date again. It's about creating small, tangible steps towards living authentically rather than letting old familiar, or I can call them comfortable patterns, rather than letting those comfortable patterns define you. Let's do this by way of an example. This is a story of a man who's beginning to let go of his grandiose defensive structure, exposing in an underworld. In other words, what we begin to see is shame, fear of exposure, and a fragile self-worth. What's striking is the convergence of multiple dynamics: narcissistic vulnerability, early relational trauma, and deep ambivalence around success and being seen. Don't worry, if that doesn't seem clear now, I'm going to make all this very clear in a moment. In a recent session, he came in reflecting on the weekend, describing a familiar feeling. Everything just sucks. That's what he said. As we unpacked that feeling, we found he was preoccupied with prospects of partnership at the firm. This is where he worked. He's been told that he needs to increase his billable hours at the job. In essence, he needs to get more clients and take on more responsibility to become partner. But rather than motivation, what he felt was dread. Slowly, we came to see that it's not simply about the workload, it's about fear. Now that the grandiose fantasy of narcissistic omnipotence has begun to fall away, and by the way, I described this in earlier episodes on healing narcissism, what that looks like, here's where we have to slow down, because this fantasy, this grandiose omnipotent fantasy, was never just, in other words, it doesn't present as just a boastful self-image. That's one way it presents. For this fellow, and for many, it's a psychic shelter, a kind of emotional armor that for years shielded him from the intolerable, the fear of inadequacy, the sting of shame, the terror of dependency. Since he was no longer sort of arming himself up, so that shield wasn't there, what slowly began to emerge was a deeper vulnerability. And I quote, this is what we came to hear him say. What if new clients come, he wonders, and they see that I'm not enough? See, that's the vulnerability right there that begins to rear its head. Instead of excitement about growth, what rises is anxiety, not because he doesn't want to succeed, I helped him see, but because success requires exposure. And exposure is loaded. In the unconscious, it's not simply visibility. It carries the emotional weight of early experiences when being noticed meant being criticized, humiliated, or shamed. To succeed now is to risk a repetition of those original wounds, if that makes sense. So his dread, it's not that he fears failure. It's the fear of being known. That's the exposure that I'm trying to describe. Why does being seen feel more dangerous than being ignored? From a psychodynamic perspective, this question cuts to the heart of narcissistic injury. For him, being ignored means he could still preserve the fantasy of who he could be. Being seen means he risked the collapse of that fantasy, and with it, the possibility of losing love. Our work together is to help him see and then tolerate the unbearable paradox here, that he can be imperfect and still worthy, limited and still lovable. That's the paradox. That's hard to believe, again, because of the split world in which many of these individuals live. Exposure stirs the very feelings that he's spent a lifetime defending against. So if he's exposed, he could be ashamed, humiliated. There could be disappointment. So you could see there's a lot of self-doubt about what? Taking on new clients. This marks a critical shift. The fantasy that once protected him from anxiety by imagining success and admiration is now gone, allowing that underlying fear to surface. Here, the patient is moving from avoiding these feelings, using perfectionism to keep them at a distance, toward what? Toward actually experiencing them. That's what's happening. This feels threatening now. He's having a feeling, and it's threatening because it brings back those old relational wounds, the grandiose sense of self. That's the narcissistic grandiose sense of self was built to protect. The dread isn't really about taking on new clients, or as I mentioned earlier in those other examples, such as going to the gym or starting to date. It's about the desire to succeed and then being seen. And then exposed as what? Inadequate. That layering is key. First the wish for success, then the exposure, then the catastrophic expectation of humiliation or abandonment. Again, I quote, what if clients come and see I'm not enough? This sequence is not random. It mirrors his earlier emotional blueprint. What you're seeing is a subtle but profound change in his defensive structure. A key therapeutic moment in narcissistic dynamics. He's beginning to tolerate a more integrated experience, one where painful feelings can exist instead of being split off or projected without being erased, right? So they could be split off, they could be projected, they could turn into idealization, they could turn into artificial self-inflation. I can keep going. But right now what you see is he's beginning to tolerate painful feelings. In other words, instead of flipping into an all good or all bad self-state, he's staying in a mixed, more complex emotional position. From a psychoanalytic lens, this hints at movement toward integration, where the self can now be seen as both competent and flawed, without this splitting. And for those of you who have tuned into earlier episodes, you may have heard me say this quite frequently. Integration is ultimately the goal when working with a personality disorder, right? Because of the fragmented sense of self. To understand where these fears come from, we need to look a little deeper into his earlier relationships. As we were discussing his fears of being seen at work as inadequate, he spontaneously recalled the ever-present threat from his father that if he misbehaved, his father might leave the family. In those moments, the implicit message he received was what? You are not good enough. Not good enough as a son, and today, not good enough at his job. And it didn't stop there. He was repeatedly told that he was selfish, faced threats of abandonment, and witnessed his mother's anger as well, who labeled him as selfish and, I quote, lazy. Again, from a psychodynamic standpoint, this is the moment the past collapses into the present. See, there's no differentiation between past and present. The demand for more clients in the firm becomes symbolically fused with his father's threats and his mother's critical rage. Taking on new clients is charged with the same threat of what? Withdrawal and condemnation, with the same threat of criticism and loss. With his father, the threat of leaving was real and constant. This early experience laid the groundwork for his underlying fear and shame. What if they come? That's the clients. What if they come and see I'm not enough? The dread isn't really about having more clients. See, that's simply the manifest presentation. It's about being truly seen, yet not wanted, and then not measuring up and not meeting his father's rigid expectations. This fear persists despite clear, objective evidence that his firm wants him to succeed. That's because in the internal world, we call this in my field the internal object world, and I quote father, I put father in quotes, right? Because this is like an internalized father now that he carries around with him. The father still holds the power to withdraw love at the first sign of what? Imperfection. The mind remains loyal to these early relational templates, even when reality offers a very different story. Remember I said, the people at the firm want him to succeed. That contradiction reveals something important. This isn't about reality. And that's why so many other treatment approaches that focus on reality aren't typically very successful. You have to deal with what goes on below or outside of reality. It's the lasting power of an internal world shaped by what? The father's shaming him, the mother's critical voice, unmet needs, and impossible standards that he can never live up to. The therapeutic task here is not simply to convince him of reality, that he could take this job or that he could get the new clients, but to help him slowly experience new relational patterns in therapy and in life that disconfirm the inevitability of rejection when he's known. How do you heal when external success can't touch your internal shame? No matter what success he achieves, it never fully penetrates the unconscious conviction that he's inadequate. And that's why many of these individuals, there's a feeling that they always need more. This is a core feature of narcissistic vulnerability. External validation does not disprove the internalized shame, helplessness, and worthless feelings. So external validation doesn't work, okay? This is where we see the limits of performance-based defenses when these people are always trying to perform. No achievement, accolade, or recognition can erase the deeply ingrained relational template formed in early childhood. The grandiose self can succeed externally, but internally the child who feared abandonment remains alive if, again, one is only getting these external accolades. Disconnect between outer success and inner fear and insecurity isn't just a superficial inhibition or a surface level conflict. It points to a deeper structural split rooted in early relationships. This split isn't just normal ambivalence. That's what I'm saying. Many of us feel ambivalent about moving forward in life or taking on more responsibility. But this isn't that type of ambivalence. It's a narcissistic structure built on an early wound. I had to become exceptional to be safe. See, that's the inner logic. But deep down, I never believed it because my father continued to what? Threaten me and to be disappointed with me.
Let's take a quick break.
Are you tired of feeling like you're walking on eggshells all the time? Do you feel drained, confused, or like nothing you do is ever good enough? Are you stuck in a cycle of elation, then criticism and confusion? If any of this sounds familiar, you're not alone. And that's exactly why I created Office Hours with Dr. Anthony Mazzella. That's me. Office Hours is a low-cost, small group space where you could bring your questions about narcissistic traits and dynamics and the places where you feel stuck. You'll be met with honest, grounded feedback. I'll hold the group with structure, but there's also space for a real conversation. This is a space designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If that sounds like you, just click the link in the show notes to join us. Okay, I hope to see you there. The very thing that he longs for, to be truly seen and accepted, is the thing that he actually fears the most. That's the paradox. Because being seen means what? Again, I come back to this, risking exposure. So he wants to be seen, but if he's seen, he could be exposed. And not just exposure of his flaws, but of the part of him that still feels like he's not enough, that he's weak, that he's lazy, he's undeserving, and terrified of being abandoned. Remember, those were all the threats from early on. This paradox, the simultaneous wish and fear, is at the heart of the narcissistic bind. The grandiose self was never like a neutral protection, right? The grandiose self never just protected them. It was a double-edged shield that what it did was it defended them. Yes, it did, of course, against shame. And it kept the true, vulnerable self hidden from relational experience. But just to be very clear, what if the very thing that you long for, being truly seen, being more successful, developing a more intimate relationship or dating, again, to pull on those earlier examples I mentioned, is also what you fear the most? That is at the core of the narcissistic dilemma. That's the bind that these people get caught up in. It's in this bind between the wish to be seen and the terror of being exposed that the work has begun to deepen with this fellow. He no longer fully believes these fears, but you can hear that his emotional conviction is still alive. What if they come and see that I'm not enough? What if I'm criticized? What if I'm judged? Okay, I know this is complicated, but I hope I'm demonstrating how he's starting to feel a grief that was never allowed to come to the surface in the earlier parts of the treatment. He's beginning to see that the grandiose fantasy didn't just elevate him, it concealed something softer, but far more scary. This has opened the door to exploring what was hidden beneath the grandiose self, a fragile sense of worth, and the shame tied to the painful internalized belief. Remember I mentioned that earlier, that what? He's not enough. That simply being himself was never enough to keep his father from leaving or his mother from criticizing him. From a psychodynamic lens, this moment where grief, fear, and longing coexist is crucial. Healing is not about erasing shame or building confidence alone. You heard me mention that before, that no amount of confidence, although confidence, if it's genuine, of course, is going to be helpful. But healing alone, right, erasing shame is about learning to inhabit the self that's been hidden. Let me say that a different way. Healing must involve learning to tolerate what's been hidden and tolerating the vulnerability that was once unbearable. What's the vulnerability here? It's the taking on the new clients. It's the dating. It's going to the gym, right? Because all of these things have to do with what? Being exposed. This is the stage where narcissistic defenses loosen just enough to allow authentic emotional experiences. So in other words, if one musters up the courage to take on the new clients, to go on a date, right? What's going to come up is a new experience. And that's really where the work gets interesting, is looking more closely at all of what comes up when one puts themselves in a more vulnerable position, because now they're in uncharted territory. So, this is the hard and hidden work of healing narcissism. All of this, what I'm describing here, is about healing narcissism. It's not just taking away the defense of grandiosity. It's the slow, courageous process of coming into contact with the self as it really is, not grandiose, not worthless, but complex, vulnerable, and dare I say, human. And you see, I say, dare I say human, because being human, of course, to someone who's struggling with narcissistic tendencies is terrifying. Because what does human actually mean? Human means being vulnerable. Human means living in reality. But what's in reality? Uncertainty. Because we don't know what's going to happen if he takes on new clients. It is possible that they show up and they do feel that he's not enough. It's not like that's a delusion. That fear could be legitimate, but that's part of being human and existing in the world, is that there's uncertainty. And with uncertainty comes what? That one can really be rejected. All right, look, there's still so much more, right, to say about this. So much more to say about how these inner dynamics play out in relationships. They play out in work. But most importantly, they play out in your self-perception, the way you perceive yourself and others. But we have to stop here for now. If this spoke to you and you're curious to learn more about what healing narcissism really looks like, please consider supporting the podcast. Take a moment to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And more importantly, leave a review to help others find this work. Doing so helps the podcast grow. So if you could leave a review and the podcast grows, that will allow me to continue creating content that supports you, I hope, in understanding and navigating your own experiences with narcissism. Thanks for being here with me. I'm grateful we got to explore this one together. Stay tuned. There'll be more upcoming episodes on healing narcissism because it's very complicated, as you all know. But until next time, take care of yourself. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.